Welcome to episode 51 of Real Health Radio. You can find all the links talked about as part of the show at the show notes at www.7, and that's all spelled out, so seven health.com/51.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. This week I'm interviewing a guest, and my guest is Ari Whitten. So Ari is actually my guest on, I think it was episode 4 of the show. And this is the first time that I've had a guest return, but I really love Ari's work and his take on things, and so I wanted to have him on for a second round. And so as part of the show, we discuss an overfeeding experiment that I did at the start of the year and why I may have seen the results that I did, where I didn't have very much weight gain despite eating a huge amount of calories. So we look at the reasons behind that. We talk about genetic components, and we talk about NEAT. We look at the concept of calorie flux and what this means and why it's important. We talk about the Amish paradox, the impact of environment on our choices, and a concept known as hormesis. And this was something that I didn't know about, that I've learned recently through Ari's work. So I wanted to chat about it, and he explains what it is and why it's so important. So Ari is just so easy to chat with, and I had a really good time doing this. It's why I've invited him on again. He's incredibly knowledgeable. So I'm going to probably have him on again at some future point. But without further ado, this is my interview with Ari Whitten. Hi, Ari. Welcome back to Real Health Radio. How are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you doing? It's a pleasure to be back.
Cheers. Well, look, you are the first guest that I've ever had come back on the show, and I'm really excited to have you back on here. What I'm going to do for everyone, I'm going to link to the first show in the show notes. It is actually my second most downloaded episode of all time, so you should definitely check it out if you haven't already. So first time round, we went through a bit of your backstory in detail, so I don't want to go over that too much, but maybe just give the short version of who you are and what you do.
Sure. So I kind of started when I was very young in the health, nutrition, fitness field. Mainly typical teenager, kind of in the bodybuilding community, wanted to get muscles and get girls, and that's really my early beginnings. Was my older brother was a personal trainer, and his mentor was a bodybuilder, and so I was kind of coming into the whole community of nutrition and fitness from that angle.
Yeah. And
I would say for the first 10 years, that was pretty much the dominant force for me. The dominant perspective that I was getting information from: nutrition, exercise physiology, biomechanics, books, things like that. And then I went on to do my first degree in kinesiology and got my BS in kinesiology from San Diego State University. And then went on to be a personal trainer and nutritionist for about 10 years. And now have written, a couple years ago, wrote a book called Forever Fat Loss, which was a pretty big hit and still doing very, very well. And recently launched a program called the Energy Blueprint. So I've kind of transitioned from more of a bodybuilding, just body composition focused, more into the health and disease prevention and increasing your energy levels type of niche.
Yeah. And you also wrote the low carb myth, which was part of the reason I had you on last time, just because it's such a great book and people should definitely check it out as well.
Yeah, thank you.
So earlier this year, I did an overeating experiment. And again, I've done a whole podcast on this. So for those listening who want to check it out, I'll put it in the show notes. But as a brief overview, for 9 weeks, I ate just shy of an extra 35,000 odd calories. But I only finished the experiment weighing an extra 1.2 kilos or 2.6 pounds. And within a couple of weeks, I was back to where I started. And now at this stage, I'm like 3 kilos or 6.6 pounds lighter than when I was then. And I know that Ari listened to that podcast or some of it because he reached out after I did the show. And he asked me on a Facebook comment, like, had I looked into the genetic and the NEAT components as part of this experiment. So this is what I want to talk about for part of today's episode. So, like, to start with, do you want to just explain maybe the genetic component and how this can impact on somebody's response to, like, overfeeding or to weight gain?
Yeah. So first of all, let's kind of take a little bit of a back step and just say, you know, for all your viewers, there are actually studies where researchers have taken groups of people and basically force fed them many, you know, hundreds or thousands more calories each day than they would normally eat. So very similar to the type of experiment that you did with yourself, just with groups of people.
Yeah, I think it was the Vermont prison experiment was the one that caught my eye like years ago and was always really interesting, where these guys were eating like 10,000 calories a day and had hit a ceiling of just couldn't put on any more weight.
Right. Yeah. So one of the things, I mean, and so basically they've done these studies and they know that, you know, you can overfeed people for a period of time, and there's a range of responses that you see when that happens. So some people put on lots of fat really easily, and other people don't. Other people really are resistant to putting on fat, despite, you know, based on the simple calorie math of the situation, you would add up these numbers and see, oh, well, they have a calorie surplus of this many thousand calories, so they should have put on, you know, 10 pounds of fat, and yet they only weigh like 2 or 3 pounds more than they did initially. And so some people follow that trend very closely to what calories in, calories out would predict, and other people really don't, or like just don't follow it at all. And it seemed the math just doesn't add up. And then once the overfeeding experiments stop, you also see somewhat of a range of responses from there. So basically, you stop force feeding people and you say, okay, now you can go back to eating however much you want, whatever's normal for you. And you know, you don't have to restrict calories, just eat whatever's normal, whatever you want, whenever you feel like eating.
Yeah. And
most people will start to go back down to their initial starting point weight. Some people do that faster and easier than others. And some people, you know, are only coming from a very short, you know, a small elevation in their body fat to begin with, and they just return back to their original weight, you know, like that, like within a few weeks.
Yeah.
Other people kind of stay up there a little longer or plateau and don't really go back to their initial weights very easily. So that's kind of the bigger picture context of this, of, you know, the fact that we've done these experiments and that we see these range of responsiveness in terms of how much weight people gain and how quickly they lose it.
Yeah.
So then from there, basically there's also research looking into why does this happen? What are the factors that differentiate between, you know, that dictate why some people gain more weight or less weight? And basically the two biggies there are genetics and NEAT. And those are actually intertwined to some extent. So basically some people have a genetic tendency where they deal really well with a calorie surplus. And in response to overfeeding, their bodies just naturally upregulate not just their metabolisms, and actually the metabolism is probably a minor player in this,
yep,
but their energy levels and their spontaneous drive towards gentle movement, so non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And basically their bodies just start burning off much more of the energy as more energy is coming into the system. And so they maintain a relatively stable body weight despite, you know, overfeeding, and based on the calorie math of that, you'd predict that they gain all this weight, and they don't, because basically their body's just ramping up the energy burning machinery and burning it off.
And I think I mean, when I think back to like my family, it was quite interesting. I was having a conversation with my parents recently about this, and my great aunt recently passed away just before her 98th birthday. And so they went to the funeral for that, and it was on my dad's side. And my dad is very, very lean, has a very similar body shape to me. And they were then looking at his other relatives who all like live a really long life and are all just very naturally lean. And then on my mum's side, not so much. And she has sort of more of the womanly shape. And if I look at my like brother and sister, they have more of a tendency to put on weight, where I've always been lean, like basically no matter what I do.
Right. Yeah. And that's, you know, there's an aspect of this that's actually very commonsensical and that's very obvious, because a lot of people hear this information that I just said and they go, oh, you know, I wonder if I have the genetics to stay lean despite overfeeding.
Yeah.
And the answer to that question is actually pretty obvious, because our culture is sort of wired to promote overeating. And if you have the type of genetics that do really well in response to overfeeding and that just naturally burn off the energy, well, you're probably already lean right now.
Yeah.
Okay. And if you're not genetically blessed in that regard, you're probably not very lean. Yeah. And so the answer is kind of right there to a large extent. And, you know, just to go back into some of the details of the studies, they actually have done really nice studies with identical twins.
Yes.
And they look at pairs of identical twins in response to overfeeding, and they see that there's this intra-pair similarity. So what that means is pairs of people who are identical twins have a very similar response to overfeeding compared to other types of identical twins. So, you know, some of the twins gain fat really easily and others of the twins basically keep it off. And so that's why we know that there's this genetic component. And we're lucky in that sense that they've, you know, researchers have done such, you know, well-controlled experiments on this subject to really discern those factors and figure it all out.
And so then, like the NEAT side of things, for anyone who doesn't know what NEAT is, do you want to explain a little about that? Because it's not about
Sure.
being tidy or organized, and then also explaining like how then NEAT fits in with weight gain or weight loss or as part of these overfeeding studies.
Right. So NEAT stands for non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And it's basically, you know, so you can think of it as like three general components to the calories out side of the equation. So one is your resting metabolic rate. This is just how much body your body's burning completely at rest. Like if you were in bed rest in a coma or in a sleep state, your body would just have certain processes, you know, your heartbeat, your lungs moving, certain parts of your brain operating, and how much, you know, the amount of energy that's being burned off just through those processes that are on autopilot. Then you have, you know, exercise. So if you go to the gym and do a workout, you burn off energy during that. And then you have NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which is basically the energy that you burn if you're just standing here and, you know, doing little head movements and walking and moving your hands around, basically all the different types of gentle movement that you do throughout the day that are not, you know, like formal exercise.
Yep.
And so this, you know, NEAT is basic. There's research now that NEAT is a pretty big player in the obesity epidemic. Okay. And some researchers, for example, James Levine of the Mayo Clinic has written a book on this subject called Move a Little, Lose a Lot. And he's really promoted the idea that NEAT is probably the single most important factor in the obesity epidemic. More important even, he argues, than nutrition or exercise, which are the two biggies that most people are focused on. And basically, you know, there's a couple components to NEAT in this sense. So one is the component that we've already talked about, which is sort of this genetically predisposed tendency to respond to calorie surplus. by just spontaneously moving your body. So in this case, people who are wired with the type of genetics that, for example, you probably are people that when they overfeed, they'll just, without trying, without any conscious decision, they'll just start moving their body more. They'll be more restless. They'll be tapping their feet around a lot. They'll want to get up and move their body much more. Yeah. Whereas people who are not blessed with that set of genetics, they will just stay seated. Even though they have this calorie surplus coming in, they stay seated a lot more of the time. And in fact, they've quantified this, and they know that people who with a tendency towards obesity tend to sit down about 2.5 hours longer each day than people who have more of a lean phenotype. So that's one component to it. And then the other component is it's not necessarily the genetic aspect of NEAT, of the unconscious drive towards movement. It's the fact that our lifestyles have changed dramatically over the last 50 or 60 years. And people used to do a lot of very, very high NEAT jobs, for your daily existence. If you had to go out and tend to the fields and do, some type of gardening or farming work and tend to the animals or do blacksmithing or, pottery or something like that, these were physical jobs that required you to move your body. Yeah. And over the last 50 or 60 years, we've really transitioned into more and more sedentary type of jobs where a lot of people, a huge chunk of the population, just sits down all day in a chair while, the only part of their body that they're moving are their fingers, as they're typing on their computer. So both of those two aspects of NEAT play a role in the obesity epidemic.
And I think from my perspective, I am naturally lean and this way inclined. But the other side is I then have a lot of NEAT as part of my regular day-to-day. So I moved out to the country 3.5 years ago. I've got a dog. I'm outside walking anywhere from like 90 minutes to 2 hours a day in the countryside. I'll go to the gym 2-3 days a week. When the experiment was on, I wasn't doing this so much, but now I play golf like 3 or 4 times a week. So just lots of constant low-grade movement all the time. And as part of the experiment, I didn't actively do any extra like exercise, whether that be NEAT or whether that be actual formal exercise. But I am someone who naturally fidgets a lot when I'm working. I'm constantly up and down from my desk and all of that. So, yeah, I think there is definitely that genetic component in there.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, it's interesting. If you take someone like you with maybe some blessings genetically, and then you add in really smart lifestyle changes and, high levels of NEAT and exercise and, or even moderate NEAT and exercise, you basically make it impossible for your body to gain fat to the point where you can literally try to make yourself as fat as possible. And as long as you maintain your NEAT and exercise habits, you can force feed yourself 1,000 extra calories each day and you're going to stay lean.
Yeah. Yeah. My body will max out and tell me to stop eating before weight starts going on. And that was the problem. The experiment was meant to be 12 weeks. I pulled the plug at 9 because I physically can't do this anymore. And my weight is coming down. So for the last 3 weeks, despite overeating, my weight started to come back down. Right. And then the thing is that I've had 3, and I talked about this as part of the podcast, and I've talked about this in separate articles, is that the 3 times in my life where I have put on weight have all been times when I've eaten less because they were times of great stress.
Right.
So I had a time where I was having to sort out my visa. I couldn't work for a number of months, didn't know where I was going to end up living. Another one where I was living in a house, and they decided to, after 2 weeks of moving into that new place, build the Crossrail tunnel outside it, and the Mayor of London gave the green light for them to basically work whenever they wanted. So it was like living in a construction site for a year while my girlfriend's health went to pot, and then I was having to deal with that. And then more recently, girlfriend had an ectopic pregnancy and having to deal with that. And those were all incidences in which I ate a hell of a lot less because I was stressed, and yet my weight went up quite quickly in those circumstances. So that's really interesting. And then any time that stress has then subsided and I've got things back under control, my eating goes back up, my weight comes back down.
Yeah, stress is a nightmare in terms of nutrient partitioning. And for me too, regardless of any real significant changes of calories in or calories out, when I'm under severe stress, my muscle just will disappear amazingly quickly, and I'll start to put on fat, even if I'm eating less, and so stress just takes whatever nutrients you're eating and just puts it into fat and destroys your muscle mass. And I mean, chronic stress is just a nightmare in terms of body composition.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that I focus so much on with clients now. Like, yes, we're doing the nutritional side of things, but there is so much more of like, we've got to get your circadian rhythm sorted out. We've got to get you sleeping better. You should be doing meditation. You should be spending the morning part of your day outside, getting sunshine, like all of these different things to manage the stress. Because it doesn't matter if people are eating a perfect diet. If they're not doing that other stuff, it will really start to catch up with them.
Yep. Yeah, and that's the thing that I find a lot of people make the mistake of. They assume that just because they're doing one thing or two things right, that they should be getting results, and they're baffled by the fact that maybe they're not. The reality is there are so many aspects of the modern lifestyle that are not in harmony with the way our biology is designed, the kind of environment we're designed for. Yeah, that this is really a complex thing. It's not just as simple as like, you count your calories and you go to the gym a couple times a week and everything's solved. There's a lot of different aspects of health, and it requires a lot of knowledge and expertise to really comprehensively address all of these different factors and optimize them so that you can make a significant improvement in your health, your energy levels, your body composition, or all of those. It's not an easy thing. It takes time.
No. I mean, reflecting on my situation, as I said, I moved out to the countryside 3.5 years ago. That change alone has been the best thing ever for my health. And I was a pretty healthy guy anyway, but just because of the environment it puts me in, same with part of the reason we moved out here, my girlfriend wasn't very well at the time. And it's been the best thing that we've ever done for her health. And she's now constantly out riding horses, working really long days, always burning the candle at both ends. But she can get away with so much more now. And that is just purely down to us being out here as opposed to living in London.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I drove across the country recently as I moved from Florida to California, and drove through a lot of, you drive through, for your European viewers, they're not super familiar with all the different states that you would drive through, but you drive through a chunk of Florida, and then you go into Louisiana and Alabama and then Texas, and a lot of these southern states, Louisiana and Alabama. I had never even been there. I knew nothing about them. For a kid from California, the culture there could not be more different and strange. Yeah. But we drove through New Orleans, and I remember just as soon as we got in there, just seeing the type of people that were in this crazy big city environment and how they looked. Almost everybody looked incredibly unhealthy to me. And I'm like, I got to get out of this environment. This is not a good environment for human health. And it wasn't even a conscious thing. I just had this visceral reaction to seeing people living in this environment and how unhealthy they looked. I'm like, I got to get out of here. This is not the place where humans should exist. And I think urban environments are really not conducive to human health. Unless you have a really good situation of the place that you live that's insulated from a lot of the air pollution, the noise pollution, the light pollution, and you're really insulated from all that. If you're not insulated from all that, it's really tough to be healthy in those kind of environments.
Yeah. But I guess that's a very difficult sell to make when the majority of the population wants to live in those big cities. I think I saw it was a Paul Campos interview where he was saying that one of the best things that people could do would be to become a farmer or move to somewhere rural. But he's like, no one talks about that. Everyone talks about calories and all of these other things, when actually that's probably one of the best things for life extension and better health.
Yeah, absolutely. Even in the case of my girlfriend, since we moved here to San Diego, and we spend time at the ocean every day, and we just go in the water and we body surf and we play with our dog and stuff like that. She's had, little skin rashes that emerge sometimes, and she's had it for like years. As soon as we moved here, they disappeared.
Yeah.
So, and little symptoms like that, and then a lot of people have had this experience. If they think about it, they have some kind of symptoms, gastrointestinal distress, fatigue, skin problems, whatever. And then they go on vacation down to Costa Rica or something like that. And they spend a couple of weeks there and, all of a sudden my symptoms went away. And so why is that? And part of it is, maybe lower stress levels when you're on vacation. But another part of it is that the environment that we're in has a huge impact on our health. And it absolutely is massively overlooked. And, people sort of, like you said, operate from this assumption that we're all equal, and we all need to just focus on our nutrition and go to the gym, and then everything's going to take care of itself.
Yeah.
But the reality is the place that you live in is a huge piece of the puzzle in terms of your health and your energy and your body composition. It really is. And I understand it's not the easiest thing for people to address. It's the hardest thing for people to actually address that, but it definitely is a big factor.
Yeah. And so just getting back to like the neat side of things and calories, there's a concept that you talked about before, which is calorie flux. I've talked about it with clients, and I think it's a really important idea. But for those who are unfamiliar with it, do you want to explain a little about what it is and what it means?
Sure. Yeah. So it relates to calories in, calories out. Okay. But it's not the way that people normally talk about calories in, calories out. So the way that most people talk about this is in terms of calorie deficits and calorie surpluses, which means, okay, I have this much calories in and this much calories out, so they're equal, so I'm going to maintain my weight. Or now I have this much calories in and this much calories out, so now I'm going to gain weight. Now I have this much calories in and this much calories out, so now I'm going to lose weight. And that's how most people are used to thinking of the calories in, calories out equation. Now, flux is a different concept. Flux is basically describing whether you're regulating calories in, calories out at, here, let's say, at a lower level of calories in, calories out, or at a higher level. So the body's always striving for this balance. Okay. So like kind of we talked about with the overfeeding experiments and your situation, you bumped up your calories in, and then what did your body do? It went like this.
Yeah.
Right. And so we also know from from diets studies and underfeeding studies that if you go the other way and you sort of deprive your body of calories, then, you'll lose weight for a period of time, but then your body starts to go like this, right? And lower the calories outside of the equation. So the body's always striving for this equality in terms of calories in, calories out. And it's, if you adjust something, it adjusts something to try to balance those two things out. So what flux is basically describing whether you're doing that, whether you're regulating that energy balance down here or up here, low flux, high flux. So as an analogy, you can think of this in terms of like a hose. So picture a hose that's, that big around, and it's got a little trickle of water flowing into it and out of it. Now, in contrast, you have a big fire hose just pumping water like crazy, and it's just flying out of there, at 100 gallons a minute, or, just massive amounts of water.
Yeah.
So that's low flux through the hose versus high flux. Now, to make this sort of more practical in terms of how you understand it on a human level, think of on one end of the spectrum, you have somebody who is totally sedentary and they're working a desk job, they do zero exercise, and they're also on a diet because they want to lose weight. They're a little overweight, and so they're trying to restrict their calorie intake. Okay, so they're in this situation, no exercise, super low NEAT, and, calorie restriction. On the other end of the spectrum, you have someone like Michael Phelps, or like any elite athlete who's eating just massive amounts of food each day. And they're also training like maniacs and doing massive amounts of physical exercise each day. And guess what? They're very lean. So they're burning through all of that energy, even though they might be eating 8,000 calories each day. They're just burning right through it, and they're staying lean with abs, right? So that's what flux is. Well, it turns out there was a recent study on this subject that basically your flux is a huge determinant of your long-term trends in body composition. So it's not necessarily your calorie intake that is going to determine what your body composition, how fat or lean you are in the years to come. It is actually much more the case that flux, your level of flux, will determine how fat or lean you get in the years to come. If you have a very low flux, that is a huge predictor of fat gain. Now, basically, every study on the subject of flux has found that this is a significant predictor of fat gain, and that it's having higher levels is a significant predictor of fat loss in the long term. The other thing that's worth mentioning here is there's something called the Amish paradox. Are you guys familiar with the Amish people?
I know like small amounts. Personally, I know small amounts. I don't know what my listeners know about the Amish people.
Yeah, so it's a very old a group of people that's, they've been in the United States since basically the founding of the United States, or right around that time. And they've really maintained their traditional ways of life, that they had 200 years ago. They've kind of insulated themselves from American culture, and they're their own little entities, and they have their own towns and villages and their own ways of life, and they don't really care about what everybody else in America is doing. They're just like, oh, this is who we are. This is what we do.
Yeah.
And so they don't use cars. I mean, granted, there are probably ones that have differing degrees of modernization, but the really old Amish groups that have maintained their ways of life, they don't have computers and they don't have cars and stuff that they're driving around, at least not for the most part. They're using horse and carriage. They're doing manual labor in the fields, tending to, doing farming, tending to the animals and things like that, washing clothes by hand, and all these traditional ways of life. And there's a phenomenon that researchers have identified called the Amish paradox. And it's not really a paradox, but they call it that. But basically, they found that these groups of people eat a very high fat, high flour, high sugar diet, and yet they're remarkably lean. They're basically the leanest group of people in the United States. And so why is that? Well, it's because they're out in the fields tending to the animals and doing farming and things like that, and they're doing manual labor. And they do remarkable amounts of NEAT and exercise every day. And basically, when you do that, you can eat a diet that is very high in fat and sugar and stay lean. Even if you don't have, even if you're not genetically blessed for it, if your level of flux is very, very high, it is extremely protective against fat gain. So, yeah, that's basically an overview of flux and why it's important. And
just with the Amish, what's their longevity like? So there's one thing, I guess, for staying lean, but in terms of their longevity, are they outliving lots of other people? Is it just the standard American length?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to it. I would presume that they live longer than average Americans, but I can't say definitively that I've actually seen the data on that.
Okay, cool. And so in terms of if someone is like hearing this about calorie flux and thinks, okay, I want to raise my calorie flux, how much of that is down to like genetics and the things we talked about earlier on, and how much of that is really within someone's control? And if it is in their control, what are the kinds of things you would be suggesting?
Yeah, so there's basically three components that will dictate a person's level of NEAT. Okay. So one is just the genetic aspect of how genetically prone are you to want to get up and move your body around, or how genetically prone are you to want to just stay seated all day long.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's one aspect of things. The next aspect is how your environment actually shapes that. So your physical environment. So if you're in a tiny cubicle and you're in an office job in this cubicle and everybody else around you is in a cubicle and everybody else around you is seated all day long, and that's, the environment that you're seeing and that's what your norm is, you will tend to do the same thing. Okay. And you'll basically sit down all day, because that's what your environment sort of is coaxing you to do. You have a chair there in front of your desk and, everybody else is doing that. So that's what you think you should do. Well, if you alter that environment, so let's say, that business gets bought out by a new boss, a new owner of the company. And he says, okay, I just read this research that shows that standing up leads to higher productivity. So we're getting all the desks out of here, and everybody's going to move to standing desks or treadmill desks. Okay, and everybody's going to do that. We're also going to take breaks every half an hour, and we're going to create like playrooms in the office. And every half an hour, people are going to go do a minute or two of physical movement and play and, just dance around. Or, every half an hour we play music in the entire office. Everybody has to get up and, just dance to the music.
Yep.
Right. Well, that's how the environment that person is in is now shaping their movement habits. So that's actually a big player as well. It's not just genetics. It's also what kind of environment are you in? Does it facilitate or not facilitate you wanting to get up and move your body? And then the last component of it is the conscious decision to move your body. And are you consciously taking steps to introduce more NEAT into your life? So people who don't think about it might just, sit down all day. But it's also possible to say, okay, well, this NEAT thing is important. I'm going to set a timer on my phone, like a mindfulness bell, to go off every half an hour. And when it goes off, I'm going to get up from my desk. I'm going to do some lunges or some squats or some push-ups, or just walk around, walk up a couple flights of stairs in my office, or just go for a walk outside for 5 minutes or something like that. And, now all of a sudden you have made the conscious decision to introduce NEAT into your life. So you have the genetic component, the environmental component, and then the conscious decision component.
Yep. And so if people can then start to be doing more of those, probably can't do much about the genetics, but the environment and then the conscious, that's the thing that is going to be most impactful on calorie flux from your perspective?
Yeah. So that's those two things, the environment and the conscious decision aspect of NEAT. And that's going to make a big difference in terms of your overall flux. And then the other aspect is the amount of exercise you're doing.
Right.
So introducing different types of exercise, introducing, weight training, high intensity intervals. Those are the most time efficient ways to increase your flux. And then if you wanted to, in addition to that, you could do some endurance exercise or cardio, and have some variety. But basically, flux is going to depend on the combination of all of those different factors.
Okay. And kind of on a similar topic, there was an article recently done by Gina Colada for the New York Times, and it was following up on participants of The Biggest Loser from season 8. So I think that was in 2009. So that show finished like 7 years ago, something like that. And so what they were doing was following up with those participants and seeing how they are like working out now. And a lot of what the article talked about, and I'll link to it in the show notes, was the impact on someone's metabolic rate, and how for these people who had been obese, who then lost all this weight, how it then turned down their metabolic rate, and quite significantly. I don't know if you saw that article and if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I did see it, and I do have some thoughts on it. So, as I mentioned before, I was a personal trainer and nutritionist for many, many years. I guess I still am. Technically, I still have all those credentials. But basically, my point is that I did very similar work with clients to what they do on The Biggest Loser.
Okay.
Now, I'm going to phrase this in a couple different ways. So one is, if I was in the situation where I was a trainer on The Biggest Loser, and I was, I had my sort of team, and the goal of the show for, me to win was to have my group of people lose the most weight possible in this time frame. And so the only concern was to go from, day one to, I don't know how long they go for, 30 days, 60 days or something like that, 90 days. And then at the end of those 60 or 90 days, we will have lost blank amount of pounds. And that's the only factors that we're concerned with. And whoever loses the most amount of pounds wins the show. Okay. If that was the case, I would do exactly what they do on The Biggest Loser, which is I would follow the same exact methods that they do. And that what they're doing absolutely is the most effective way to lose the most amount of weight possible in the shortest amount of time. Now, the other context here is, if I was not on the show and I was tasked with getting people to lose the most amount of fat in the most sustainable way that they will likely keep the fat off for their entire life, I would do things completely opposite to the way that they do them. So, as an example, they put people on extreme calorie restriction diets that are totally unsustainable. Nobody can sustain the type of diets that they're put on. So, in general, one of the first rules of dieting for fat loss is don't do any type of diet that you're not going to be able to sustain for the long term. Because if you can't sustain it for the long term, you're destined. It's just a recipe for weight regain. Okay. Now, the other aspect of this is, simultaneously to the fact that they're doing extreme calorie deprivation, is they're also introducing massive amounts of cardio, endurance exercise. Okay. And what that's doing is now exacerbating the stress load that the body's under. And so, even with just the diet alone, these people would lose massive amounts of muscle mass. Now you add in lots of endurance exercise and cardio without the weight training component, and now you're accelerating the loss of muscle mass even further.
Yeah.
So you're basically taking these people, and since the goal is not to achieve the best body transformation or the best body composition, but the goal is most amount of weight lost, weight includes muscle mass. So they're doing things in a way that lead to massive muscle losses. And when you lose weight in that way, you're pretty much guaranteed to set yourself up for weight regain.
And is that, from your perspective, because people talk about muscle is much more like active, it uses more calories than other parts of the body, that kind of thing?
Yeah. As an example here, there's a study where, I'm trying to remember the exact numbers, but basically they took groups of very overweight or obese people, and they put them both on the same exact calorie deficit diet, and they then randomized them to either a cardio or endurance training group or a weight training group. Okay. And if you actually look at the numbers, the cardio group lost like 34 pounds or something in the 12 or 16 weeks that they were doing this experiment. And the weight training group lost like 31 pounds. Okay. So, you know, a significant advantage for the cardio group. But then when you actually parse down and look at how much of that was from muscle and how much of it was from fat, the cardio group lost like 14 pounds from muscle. And the weight training group lost 0 pounds from muscle, which means they actually lost about 10 pounds more of body fat, okay, while maintaining basically all of their muscle mass. And so they also tracked their resting metabolic rate. And what did they find? They found that in the cardio group, there was a massive decline in metabolic rate. And in the weight training group, they actually, believe it or not, they actually slightly sped up their metabolic rate while on an extreme calorie deficit. So they were in, basically by virtue of the type of weight training that they were doing, they ended up maintaining their normal resting metabolic rate. So that is absolutely a factor in your susceptibility to regaining the weight.
Okay, right. And look, I don't ever watch the show, but from the little bits that I've seen, it's an inordinate amount of cardio, like a crazy amount for someone who is like an athlete or is an SAS person or whatever, and you're then taking people who have been sedentary for very long parts of their life, if not their whole life, who are carrying a huge amount of weight, who shouldn't be running for the distances that they're asked to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's basically the most ridiculous and unsustainable way of losing weight imaginable. And, you know, without knowing any statistics, just watching the method that they're trying to do to lose weight, or that they're using to lose weight, you just knowing that, you're like, okay, pretty much everybody here is destined to regain all the weight, and they have no shot of maintaining this. I actually know one guy personally who was he was on The Biggest Loser, I think about 5 years ago or 7 years ago or something like that, and he's actually still maintaining a huge chunk, if not all of the weight that he lost on the show. And he may even have lost some more compared to when he was on the show. But he is an anomaly, and he will tell you he's an anomaly because he has lots of friends who were on the show with him, and almost all of them have regained the weight. He hasn't, and the reason he hasn't is he's one of these people that are extremely type A. Right. And, you know, it's extremely obsessive compulsive. He will count every morsel of food that he eats. He counts every step that he takes religiously every day. And he does massive amounts of NEAT and cardio every day. And he actually is still following the blueprint of The Biggest Loser and hasn't done any weight training. He asked me to go over his stuff and help him optimize his program, but he lost like 30 pounds of muscle mass when he was on the show. So, I mean, that's already like a huge predisposition to regaining the weight. A much smarter approach for the initial weight loss would have been for him to maintain all of that muscle mass. And at this point, he would have a way easier time maintaining the weight and losing even further. But right now, it's just sheer willpower. It's just sheer like forcing yourself to eat very, very little and do massive amounts of cardio and NEAT every day, which is not really ideal, but, you know, a small subset of those type A, very obsessive, compulsive, controlling personalities will be able to do that.
Yeah. Because I think there was some statistic around like the dietary register or whatever. I can't remember what it's called, where if you lose X amount of pounds and keep it off for 5 years, you get in some register. And when they then look at the statistics about how those people do it, like a huge chunk of them have what, for pretty much all intensive purposes, is an eating disorder or that level of obsession around food to be able to keep it off. So rather than be like, oh, this is really good, let's follow what that person does, it's like, okay, they're able to maintain it, but it's not healthy.
Yeah, it's very true. And the other aspect I would say that's worth mentioning here is when you're living in a culture that is obesogenic, that has so many different aspects of the environment and the culture that you live that are driving you towards fat gain, you do have to be a little bit extreme in terms of your own personal lifestyle habits to create health. When you live in a culture that promotes bad health, you have to be abnormal, and you have to separate yourself from that culture at least a little bit and say, I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to create my own little bubble of an environment and, have habits that are different from the norm. Now, obviously that can be taken to an extreme of eating disorders and, where somebody's like afraid to go outside or something like that.
Yeah.
Or to go out to eat with other people for fear of temptation. But you have to find some middle ground where you're not doing what everybody else does. Because if you do what everybody else does in an obesogenic culture, you're going to end up like the majority of people. And that's not a very good destiny.
Yeah. Which is also why I think probably me moving to where I am and you being where you are, if you're then surrounded by people who are naturally very healthy, naturally very active, it becomes much more your norm. Like there's the Jim Rohn quote that I've talked about before, which is you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's huge.
And so another concept I just want to talk to you about is called hormesis. And this is something I've only heard recently you talk about. I then heard Chris Masterjohn talk about it recently as well. But for people who haven't heard that term before, do you want to explain what it is?
Sure. Yeah. So first of all, let me preface this by saying hormesis, despite the fact that most people have not heard of it, is, in my view, probably the single most important factor in health. And it's really like the basis of health. It's what makes us healthy. And yet so few people are even aware of what this is. Basically, it is a type of stressor that when it interacts with our body, stimulates adaptations that make us more resilient in the face of stress. Not just that particular type of stressor that we're exposed to, but actually across a range of different types of stressors. So it stimulates an adaptation in our bodies that actually goes beyond just adapting to whatever stressor we were exposed to, and actually creates even more resilience and robustness. Now, this may seem strange to people who are hearing this, and it might seem like very unfamiliar. Especially the fact that I use the word stressor, which almost everybody associates with a negative connotation. Stress is bad and stress must be avoided. In fact, the phenomenon is actually much more familiar than people realize, because exercise is a form of hormesis. So that's the whole basis by which exercise makes us healthy. Exercise is actually not intrinsically healthful. It is a physical stressor, and by virtue of exposing our bodies to this physical stressor of, moving around vigorously, we now stimulate our hearts to go stronger, our lungs to grow stronger, our muscles to grow stronger, our mitochondria in our cells to be bigger and stronger and more capable of producing energy and providing energy to the cell. And it creates a whole, range of different adaptations in our body, which ultimately confer increased longevity, resistance to various diseases, brain growth, all types of different beneficial health effects just from exposure to this one type of stressor. So that's the basic idea behind hormesis. Now, this goes way beyond just exercise, though. There's over a dozen different types of hormesis. And by exposing ourselves to lots of different varieties of hormesis, we can make ourselves much healthier, more energetic, and much more resistant to disease.
And one of the ones that you talked about with this is in relation to foods with say fruits and vegetables. I think this is really interesting because I think when looking at this stuff, a lot of people think the benefits or the sole benefits from fruits and vegetables are the vitamins or the antioxidants, but from a hormetic perspective, it's not quite so simple. Do you want to kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. So one of the things that's very common to hear people talk about when it comes to like fruits and vegetables in particular is we see these colorful compounds in, so for example, blueberries or blackberries, and they have these, anthocyanins, these polyphenols that give the fruit or the vegetable those rich colors. And we talk about those things commonly. It's very, in the media, we talk about them as antioxidants. So, blueberries have antioxidants, goji berries, acai berries have antioxidants, and, the red in tomatoes, those are antioxidants, and, all of these different food sources of antioxidants. And we use that word antioxidants in the same way that we do for like vitamin A or vitamin C, vitamin E. And the reality is they're not the same. They don't have the same effects on the body. And there's a huge body of research now indicating that the primary mechanism of action of these different plant phytochemicals is actually not being an antioxidant at all. So what actually is going on is these compounds are essentially plant toxins, and the plant has produced them in order to, deter various predators from eating it. So it tries to produce these toxins so that it doesn't taste very good to anything that tries to eat it, which from the plant's perspective is good, because if it doesn't get eaten, then that means it gets to stay alive and reproduce. Okay. Now there's some sort of magic going on here, because it turns out by virtue of the fact that we have co-evolved with all of these different types of plants, we have evolved a mechanism that has the capacity to detoxify these different toxins from the plants we eat. So that, obviously that would allow us to derive nutrition from these plants without killing ourselves or without any noticeable negative effects from those toxins.
Yeah.
And it actually goes even a step beyond that, because not only have our bodies evolved the capacity to detoxify these different compounds, but we have actually evolved the capacity to benefit from them. And through this specific series of enzymes, it's called phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 enzymes, they basically deactivate the toxins, and then they trigger a set of, physiological or biochemical reactions in our cells in response to those. And then, the third phase of enzymes is to sort of modify them so that they can be excreted. But that second set, the phase 2 enzymes, is really where the magic is. And it turns out that in response to consuming a lot of these different plant toxins, we have, basically the mechanisms that it triggers are pretty much the same type of mechanisms that you see triggered with other types of hormetic stressors. So, for example, exercise. So these compounds are often referred to in the scientific literature as exercise mimetics, which means the actual biochemical effects of consuming some of these plant phytochemicals mimic the biochemical effects of doing exercise, which is pretty remarkable, right?
Yeah.
So this phenomenon is called xenohormesis. It's a particular type of hormesis. And basically, humans have evolved the capacity to benefit from these particular types of plant phytochemicals. And it creates adaptations in us that really act very much like exercise in terms of expose yourself to a little bit of a toxin or a stressor, and all of a sudden it stimulates your body to grow stronger, healthier, more energetic, more resilient.
Wow. And so, I mean, you mentioned this, and where I heard you mention it was in your program called the Energy Blueprint, which I've been doing for the last 8 weeks. And I mean, I said this to you before we started recording this, like I've been really blown away by the information. I've really enjoyed listening to you, but also starting to implement that stuff with myself and with clients. So for people who are listening to this, like, do you want to just tell them a little bit about the Energy Blueprint and also like when it's going to be released again, when they can be taking it? Because I like highly recommend people signing up to this because it is a fantastic program.
Cool. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. So yeah, it's basically, a couple years ago, I set out with a goal in mind, which was to develop a science around energy levels. Energy levels was something that I felt was really neglected by the majority of people in the health and fitness and nutrition realm. Some people, talk about it a little bit here and there, but most of the information that you find online on the subject of overcoming fatigue and enhancing your energy levels was mostly pseudoscience, mostly just nothing was really grounded very well in science. So I had this goal where I wanted to develop a comprehensive science of how to take yourself from fatigued to high energy. And I thought, I'm a fairly skilled researcher and writer, and I thought it was going to take me a couple months. And it turned out it took me about 2 years of full-time effort to do this. And it was just way, way, way more complex than I could have ever imagined. But I ended up enlisting the help of lots of different experts in the field and, various physicians on the front lines of treating fatigue, neuroscientists, nutrition experts. And these people really helped me kind of do this. And I just launched the program for the first time. You were in the group that did the program for the very first time. That was about 8 weeks ago. Yeah. And I finally completed it and basically, achieved my objective of really creating a comprehensive science around how to do this. And there's a lot of really cool cutting edge information, as I'm sure that you found during the last 8 weeks. And it's basically, the feedback has just been amazing to see how many people are just transforming their health and going from being fatigued all the time and not being able to move around and having fibromyalgia and being almost debilitated to all of a sudden now their lives are really being transformed by the fact that they have energy and life and vitality in them now. So it's been a very hard process to get the program created, but it's been incredibly rewarding to see the type of effects that it's having on people's lives.
Yeah. And look, I'm obviously a practitioner, so it's pitched at a level that I find really interesting and I'm learning a lot, but is also then at a level that people who are more at the layperson level can understand. I imagine there's probably going to be for them having to watch things a couple of times because there is some real detail to it. But yeah, I mean, it just hit the chord right with that. And the Facebook group has been fantastic as well, with Ari jumping in there constantly and answering questions and finding out so much extra information through that as well. So yeah, I really enjoyed doing the program. So yeah, thank you so much for putting it on.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the feedback and the kind words.
Cool. So look, well, thank you also for coming on this podcast. It's been nearly a year that we recorded the first one, and I enjoyed doing that one. I've enjoyed today. I'm going to definitely get you on here again. For those people who want to find out more about you, where should they be going? Website and social media stuff. I'll put it all in the show notes, but yeah, just let people know.
Yeah, the website to go to would be theenergyblueprint.com, and that's where you can sign up for that program when it's, or you sign up for the launch materials when the program is going to be launched again, which is going to be in mid-September or early October. And that'll be the next round of the program. There's going to be a series of 4 videos that you'll get, and videos and documents that give a ton of valuable information on the subject of enhancing energy levels and overcoming fatigue for free. So even if you don't sign up for the program, make sure that you sign up for that and get all the free, very, very valuable content about how to bolster your energy levels.
Perfect. Well, look, thanks again for coming on the show. This was awesome. It's always great chatting with you.
Likewise. Yeah, it's been a pleasure, Chris. Take care.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.